Just so we can see how the tools work, I'm going to go ahead and click Default. One of the other things I want to point out, and you've read about it in the previous week's materials, is the histogram. This up top here is our histogram for this image. And this is if we make corrections to it, the histogram will adjust accordingly. Okay, so one of the things is when I make exposure adjustment, notice how the histogram shifts one way or another. One of the nice things about this histogram in a Camera Raw is when you roll over it, and you should be able to see it showing up as blacks, shadows, exposure, which is more of the midtones, highlights, and the white values. Okay, so if I wanted to, I can actually take this and move the exposure left to darken it or right to lighten it. So if your image was overexposed a little bit, you can actually drag it to the left and underexpose it, or vice versa. If it's underexposed a bit, you can drag it to the right. If you're ever in doubt of whether to underexpose or overexpose, it's highly recommended that you overexpose slightly as opposed to underexpose. There's a couple reasons. There's more information in that highlight area, and when you underexpose something, you introduce darker areas, which unfortunately can include a lot more digital noise in those areas. We're going to talk more about noise and how to remove some of that noise, but noise is that it's kind of like film grain. And so you'll see like red and blue pixely, splotchy areas in your image. If it was too underexposed, that can be a problem. And so we want to err to overexpose, but not so much where the highlights or the white values are completely gone. Even though something's white, it's more like it's actually a really light gray. And so if it's white, that means there's no detail whatsoever. You need some detail to actually show texture and to show shape and form. So we definitely want to make sure that we do have some highlights and have some shadows. Shadows are not completely black, otherwise there'll be big black holes. What you do want though is to have like a really dark gray that has some texture to it, so it actually still has some shape, even if it's very, very, very subtle. Okay, so our histogram up here, we can manipulate as we see fit. Again, you can move the highlights over one way or another. And notice the slider. So as I drag this, the highlight slider goes left and right. I'm always a big proponent of moving the sliders more than they need to. So in other words, if I take this at just one little smidge, I may not notice the difference. But if I take it really far, I'm really going to notice a difference. And so you can take it as far as you need to and then back it off a little bit. Or go under and you're like, nah, it's too dark, but maybe I want something a little less bright. Okay, so this exposure affects, I took it back to 0, didn't I? Affects the kind of the mid-tone values. Okay, contrast. Contrast is just the difference between the light values and the dark values. Notice how the histogram, as I move it left and right, we get more gray on gray because everything kind of condenses towards the middle. Or I can spread it out, and now we have more separation between the highlights and the shadows. But we lose the midtones. So you have to be careful. You don't want to over contrast something or have it too under contrasty. Highlights, and let me zoom in here so we can actually see a little bit better. Remember I mentioned the white drop or white balance eyedropper here. We have the zoom tool, the hand tool, and the white balance. So zoom tool allows me to zoom in. I can also use these little doodads down here. The minus sign zooms out, plus sign zooms in. If I use the hand tool, because we don't have scroll bars in Adobe Camera Raw, you need the hand tool to pan around or move around your image here. Okay, so that kind of looks a little bit better, I think. So again, back to exposure, contrast, and so on. So a contrast, again, notice how we're starting to lose some of these values in here. We bring them back, but now everything gets a little flat looking. So I can reduce the contrast a little bit. Highlights are the brightest areas. So here again, these white values here are going to be either a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. So we want to kind of find that happy medium. You may not have to change anything at all. I mean, the goal is to create correct exposure where all you're doing is sweetening the image, which means maybe you're increasing the saturation a little bit, or you're going in and just bumping up the shadow area a little bit, and that's it. That'd be the goal, not to spend hours on each image to make it perfect. It's easier to capture it correctly than it is to edit it down the line. And one thing I tell all my students is, especially if you're doing this professionally or you want to do this professionally, the more time you spend editing, the less money you're making per image. The reason is that you're not getting paid per hour to edit. You're getting paid basically by the job. So if you shoot, let's say you keep it simple, you shot one image and you were selling it for $100. You got the exposure and everything correctly. You took it through a Camera Raw and you output it to appropriate file, and it took you 5 minutes to edit. Okay, well, and it took you, let's say, 55 minutes to shoot. Well, that 55 minutes plus 5 minutes to edit is 1 hour. So you just made $100 an hour for that one image. Now put it this way, it took you 55 minutes to shoot, and it took you 1 hour and 5 minutes to edit. That's 2 hours. You just made $50 an hour. And so, you can see the longer it takes you to edit, the less money you're going to make in the long run. Okay, you could be moving on to other jobs or other projects. So don't get me wrong, using Photoshop and a Camera Raw is really fun. And initially you're going to be like, you're all in. And I think that's fantastic. But try to get efficient and fast at it, so that way down the line you can actually be more, like I said, efficient, so that way you're in and out more quickly. And a lot of that has to do with your initial capture, getting the correct exposure, getting the white balance, getting the proper focus and cropping and all that good stuff. Okay, enough preaching. Now we're on highlights. We can dial those back as we see fit. Some of the areas that you will want to double check are the shadow areas. And so those are the darker areas here and here. Now you find out what's important. Is it really important to see what's going on here? Let me zoom in one more time. Okay, is it critical? Yes, maybe, who knows? But I'm going to go ahead and increase the shadow information here so we can actually see it. So it does make a difference. We can take it too far, and as I zoom in one more level, you can kind of start to see. See, it look, I don't know if you can tell on your screen, it's probably a small video window, but here on my screen, it's kind of blotchy looking, and that's because I've given it so much more light that wasn't there, that it's actually bringing some of that noise information out. It's not clean, not smooth. So that's definitely overkill. So I'm going to bring this back a little bit so it's not so overkill. And again, if I'm zoomed in a lot, it'll be more pronounced as well. This area isn't critical. I don't really need to see what's going on back here, so I'm just going to leave that alone. If you had, zooming back in, the white areas, if the whites were too bright or too dark, you can actually go ahead and bring that back down. Again, you want to make sure you have some white values, but you don't want to have them clipped off to the edge. Notice on the histogram how it's piled up on the right-hand side here. That means it's being clipped off, or there's so many white values here that you're going to have white holes in your image, which will show the paper right through. It's okay to have a few, highlights especially are going to be bright white, and that's fine. And if I zoom back out here, I'm going to show you a little feature of Camera Raw. I'm going to go ahead and push this up a little bit farther. Okay, so that's the whites. To the left and the right of the histogram, these little arrows up here. If I click on that, that's the highlight clipping warning. I can click on this one, that's the shadow clipping warning. What that means is it's letting me know, using red for highlights and blue for shadows, that I've pushed it so far that I no longer have any detail in these areas. So I'm going to back that off, and notice as I back that off, my histogram changes on the upper right, and I'm having fewer and fewer white areas. I can bring that back to just till it has, now I'm bringing it down to the negative, which is fine. You know, some areas it's okay, like I said about the highlights on the car. You know, these little areas right here, these are little specular highlights, reflections from the sky, or from the sun. Okay, those are fine if they don't have any detail. I don't need them to. So, you know, if I bring this back to, you know, just to the right here a little bit, that's fine. We mentioned the shadow clipping warning. If I brought this way down, you know, or bring the blacks down too, I'm getting some clipping here. This blue area shows me that the shadows are being clipped. I can turn that off so I can actually see that it's true. They're being clipped. So I'm going to bring that shadow detail back up a little bit so I can actually see some. All right. And then from there, we're good to go. We'll come back to clarity, vibrance, and saturation here on a different image, one that's a little bit more zoomed in. But what I do want to show you, handy little feature, we've opened up all these images here. One of the things you'll notice is this little round circle here. This one has it, but none of the other images do. That circle denotes that it actually has edits to the image. I've made changes to the image. And so it's showing me that there's modifiers applied to it. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I select this first image. Under film strip here, I click this select all, and then it selects all the thumbnails. Now if I click this again, notice it says sync settings or synchronize settings. So I'm going to click that, and here are my options. Now I can check none, or I can check all. Okay, anything that I've adjusted on this initial image here, you know, exposure, contrast, and so on, even things that I haven't adjusted, you know, will be applied. You know, lens profile collections. If it was the same lens, pretty much at the same time, or same camera, then yes, that makes sense. You know, we didn't crop it or anything like that, but that's fine. It won't do anything. So I'm going to leave it like this: check everything, or check all, and I click OK. Now notice all these little thumbnails have that little circle indicator, and they've all been adjusted in some fashion. Okay, we won't be able to see it. If I set this back to default, that's what it looked like, and that's what it looks like now. So then you can go in to each individual image and find out maybe you need to tweak it here or there. Like maybe here, because the highlights are so much brighter, maybe I'll just knock the highlights down, and maybe even the exposure, and open up the shadows a bit more. So you can go back in and double check each image. It's a great starting point, you know, for all your images. Now you can see, you know, we have quite a few images to work through. And so you can go in and fine tune them. That's the other reason why you want to edit your images down into a manageable number, so that you're not going in and editing 20 images and fine tuning each one. It just takes too long.